All right, welcome everyone. I think I have a pretty exciting session for you today. It may not be Snoopy Facts, but I assure you it will be very exciting. And really, this is a very demo-intensive session. We'll probably spend 55 minutes of our hour together doing a demo. I have maybe 2 or 3 slides here. But basically what I'm going to walk you through is building a reporting services report. So this is reporting services we're going to look at, the typical reporting services. So this won't be Power View or anything like that. Again, like we mentioned before the session had started, there are plenty of Power View sessions that have been previously recorded. You can go look at the Pragmatic Works past recordings and view those. But this one's going to be specific to reporting services on how you can make a dynamic report off of the cube. And we're not only going to make it dynamic with the traditional ways you think, like using parameters, but we're going to take it a few steps further and actually make it metadata driven off the cube. So we're going to use things like dynamic management views to make it so that our users can actually change the different types of columns that they see on a standard reporting services report. So it should be really, really fun, really interesting session. And this is actually pulled right out of a class that we offer. We offer Pragmatic Works offers a reporting services master class that I teach. And this is actually just a small snippet of what's in that class. So you can kind of get a look and feel of that class, and if you're interested in that, I can show you where you can get a full detail outline of that class later. Okay? Just a little bit about myself. I am a consultant and a trainer with Pragmatic Works. I've written 3 books, actually 1 more coming out in a few over the next month, so I'll have 4 here soon. And then I speak at events like this one, as well as Past Summit, co-camps, user groups, and SQL Saturdays. Now again, what we're going to be looking at here is how we can make a report off of a cube dynamic. Now we're going to do this in little sections. We're going to do baby steps here where we'll walk through making it a standard report where it's not dynamic, and then we'll go through again baby steps of adding parameters to it, and then eventually making it so that those parameters are dynamic and metadata driven off of dynamic management views. So we're going to heavily use reporting services expressions to start off with, and then we're also going to make it so that our parameters can be filled via drop-down boxes or via queries using dynamic management views. So dynamic management views have been around for a couple iterations now, especially in SQL Server. They're fairly new to analysis services, but we're going to use those dynamic management views to be able to bring in cube metadata. Those dynamic management views can also be used for identifying performance problems and things like that. If you've dealt with DMVs in SQL Server, you may have used them a lot for that. So basically the end result, though, is we're going to get a look and feel of an ad hoc report against a cube, meaning we are going to give them the ability to change the measures and change different dimension attributes from our report. Okay? That's the only slide I have. You can get my contact information here. Again, you can email me or follow me on Twitter as well. I oftentimes post articles and blog posts about reporting services, so you're welcome to follow me on Twitter, where I usually broadcast those out. All right, so let's get into demo. I promised this was going to be demo intensive, and guess what? The rest of it is all demo. Now, someone asked a question earlier on before we got started. Was this going to be in tabular? Are we showing Power View? Again, this is going to be the traditional reporting services, so it's the one that you're going to use Visual Studio to develop your reports in, and it's also against the traditional multi-dimensional cubes. So really anybody that has SQL Server should be able to follow along with this, not just the folks that are lucky enough to have 2012 already in their environment. All right, so what I'm going to start you off with is showing you a very basic MDX statement here. So if you're new to reporting off of a cube, really that should have been a poll question we started off with, is not only do you do reporting services, but do you do reporting off of a cube? Because it's quite different. Many of you may realize this if you've developed reports that are based off of a cube. You have at this point realized that it's quite different to be able to return back the data off of a traditional relational database versus a OLTP multidimensional database. So when we're pulling off of a cube, we're going to be writing MDX. MDX, the query language that returns back results from a cube, just like T-SQL is the query language to return results off of a relational system. Now, I'm starting you off with a very basic MDX statement here, and I'll walk you through it, and then we'll walk through how we're going to make it dynamic. But before we make it dynamic, I'm going to get a very, very basic report off of what we see here. Okay? So what this MDX statement does is it creates two calculations for me. This with member function here, you see with member and with member, those are creating in-session calculations. In-session meaning within the limit of this query window, these calculations exist. And I'm naming those calculations selected measure and trend value. That's just the name of them. So I'm saying with member and then the name of the calculation. Again, the name of the calculation can be anything I want because I'm creating it in session here. Then I define what that calculation is by saying as, so it's like an alias. It's kind of like a CTE. If you've ever worked with CTEs and T-SQL, it has the same look and feel of it. This is just MDX. But I've named my calculation, and then I say as and provide whatever the definition of that calculation is going to be. In this case, I really have a very basic calculation I'm starting off with. This selected measure calculation isn't really a calculation at all. It's just basically interpreting or passing through a particular measure name. It's not doing anything other than saying, you have this measure inside the cube, and I want to rename it. That's going to pay off later as we go through this in baby steps. But to start off with, all I'm going to do is take this selected measure, and this internet sales amount, and rename it selected measure. Then my next calculation I have a little bit further down right here is trend value. I've named it trend value, and then after my as, my alias, what you typically think of as an alias, I have the definition of that trend value. What the definition of that trend value calculation is it does a parallel period on my selected measure. So selected measure was created up top here. I'm referencing a calculation I created in this session, and then I'm doing a parallel period. So basically, show me the internet sales. In essence, this is what I'm doing. Show me the internet sales and compare it to last year's internet sales. So you can see I'm looking 12 months back. Okay? So compare this year to last year. That's all it's doing. And if I go a little bit further down, in my select statement, you can see I'm returning those two measures. I'm returning the selected measure, and I'm returning the trend value. So those two calculations I created up top here and here, I'm now returning back in my select statement. I'm putting those on columns, so you can see on columns here. They appear on columns here. And then on rows, I'm telling it to return back the last 30 days. So I want to look basically at a trend. Over the last 30 days, show me what the internet sales were over the last 30 days compared to the internet sales of the same time period last year. And here's what the results look like. Okay? So I've hard-coded in a date range. I've hard-coded in, you can see here, I've hard-coded in, I'm going to give you the date of January 31st, 2008, and then it gives me the 30 days after that. Okay? So what I'm seeing here is the 30 days after the hard-coded date. Again, we're going to fix all these hard-coded things, and we're going to make them dynamic. And then I also see the two measures I created. I see selected measure and trend value. Okay? All right, so now what we're going to do with this MDX, I'm going to take this queries, and I'm going to bring it into reporting services. Now I'm looking at reporting services here. This is the traditional Visual Studio style reporting services where I have a just empty report. I went ahead and got a connection created, and I got an empty report created because I figured you guys know how to do that. Okay, so I have a connection to my cube and a blank report. I'm going to go over to my report data tab over here and make sure I connect my data source to my shared data source. Okay. All right. And then I'm going to go under my data set and create a new data set. So the data source, I'm not going to get into any more detail. Again, this is a little bit more advanced session. I assume you know how to create a connection and that sort of thing. But I'm going to right-click on my data sets and create a brand new data set here. Point it to the data set that we just created a moment ago. I'm sorry, the data source. So I just created this AdventureWorks Cube data source a moment ago. I'll go ahead and select that. And then I'll go to the Query Designer. Now most of you, when you create reports off of a cube, likely use this query designer and drag and drop in any of the fields that you need. So you probably go under the measures, drag and drop any of the measures that you want, go underneath the dimensions and drag and drop any of the dimension data you want. Okay? In my case, I've already written the MDX out. But let's say you had done that. Let's say that you had dragged in something from date, like the month, and you dragged in a measure from internet sales, whatever it may be. So this gives you a list, and it actually writes the MDX for you under the covers. If you wanted to see the MDX that it writes for you, you could hit this little button in the top right, this design mode button. Let me get my zoom tool here for you. Sorry about that. I should have had that ready for you. So if I zoom in over here, you can see this tool or this little button here will actually flip back and forth between the query designer that you get the drag and drop interface and the actual MDX. So this is the MDX that it just wrote for me. And you'll notice it puts a lot of other things in here. It has the background color, the fore color, all the stuff that comes through in the MDX when you do the drag and drop. Now for our scenario here, I've already written the MDX, so I'm just going to replace what I drag and dropped in here with the code that I have already written. And by the way, I will provide the code. I'll put this code on my blog later, so you guys will be able to find it. Okay, so I'll run this query. Again, we already ran the query in Management Studio, so we should assume that it will work, and it does. And really the only three columns I care about here are the date, the selected measure, and the trend value. And I'm going to use those three columns inside my report. The rest of them kind of came along for the ride because I pulled in my hierarchy. Okay, so I have the data set, the initial data set, exactly how I want it. I'll hit OK and hit OK again. Now, probably the best way to demonstrate this will be via a chart of some kind. So you can tell within the data set that this is really trend data, right? You can see this is data I'm showing over time. So it would really make sense to show this in some kind of a trend line or in a chart of some kind. So to better represent this, I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to go back to Reporting Services, go to my toolbox, and I'll bring in a chart. And again, this is a trend, so it probably makes sense for it to be a line chart. So I'll select Line Chart and hit OK. Make this quite a bit larger, give it a little more real estate. Okay. All right, now how I'd like to do this so that we can represent the data properly is I'm going to bring in my date as a category. So I'll drag in date on top of my report, and I'm going to drop it in underneath the category right here. And what that did, when I dropped it underneath the category, I can now see, or I will see, a line or a line on my chart for every single date. Not a line here. These are actually series, but a line or a tick mark going horizontally on my chart here. Now I also want to bring in the two measures. So I have selected measure. I'll bring in under the values. And trend value I'll also bring in under values. Okay, so this is going to give me a comparison. This will allow me to compare this year to last year. Okay, and if I preview this, let's see what we have so far. Again, this is just the initial design. We're going to get into making it dynamic here shortly. So we have a couple issues here. First of all, you can see that there's a big gap here in our line. So our line chart has a gap. And if you look closely, you'll see why. The dates here are not properly sorted. So you can see there's an issue there that we need to fix. So we'll definitely make sure we do that here in a moment. And then we're also going to need to look at things like the labels and all these different things in the tick marks. If I want a tick mark for every value I have, that sort of thing, we have a little work to do here. Okay. All right. So first things first, let's go and fix our sorting because we have an obvious issue here with a sorting where we're getting a gap in our line because the sorting is not done properly. So I'm going to go back to the design of my report. I'm going to go to my category group for my date here and go to the category group properties. And here this is just like a grouping you would have in a table or a tablix here. I see that it's grouped on date, and I can go under sorting here and tell it that I really want to sort this not based off of the string of my date, but based off the actual date time value of my date. So think about this. Oftentimes when you bring in things from a cube, it's going to assume that whatever the value is that you're bringing across from a dimension is a string. And in this case, it sees the value of January 31st, 2008, and January spelled out as a character. It's assuming that that is a string and not necessarily a date. So it's ordering it based off of the alphabetical order and not the chronological order. Because if you noticed in my report when I previewed it, January was at the end and February was before it. Okay, so the easiest way to fix this is I can come into the expression of this, and I'll change this from just being the date, and I'll convert it to a date. Instead of just being a string for the date value, I'll convert it to a date time value. This is just a reporting services expression. So I'll use that reporting services expression to actually make sure that it understands that this really is a date when it's attempting to sort it. Okay, so let me show you what that did. Preview this again. And we can now see January actually is not appearing, but it's up here in the front. Okay. And you can also see that we don't have any gap in our line chart anymore. So we fixed the major issue there. Okay. We could also fix the increment of our tick marks. You can see we see a kind of random interval here of our tick marks. If we wanted to see every single value for our date, we could fix that as well by going under the design, right-clicking on our horizontal axis properties, and I could change the interval here from auto to something like 1, and then we should see a value for every date we have. Okay. Now this is just standard reporting services fixes I'm doing, but you get the idea. This is going to better represent the data and allow you to see exactly what I'm talking about a little easier. So I'm going to make this a little wider for you. Okay. Preview that one more time. Now we can see the dates a little better. Okay, so we've gotten some standard fixes to our report so we can understand the data better as we go through and make it dynamic. Now in my first attempt to make this dynamic, we're going to change the query that we have and turn it into an expression. And here's what I mean by that. I'm going to go back to my code that we looked at earlier inside Management Studio. And I'm going to scroll down here a little bit because I have my dynamic data set here as well. Okay. So basically what I've done here, I actually could not run this inside of reporting services if I wanted to. But basically what I'm doing is I'm replacing anywhere I had hard-coded values. Say, for example, I had the measure name hard-coded here. I replace it with a parameter. So I replace this with a parameter. I replace the date with a parameter, how many months I want to look back with a parameter. It's all becoming parameter-based, so that way my users have a little flexibility. So that way they can type in a measure they want to look at instead of having to rely on the one that I create for them. So we're making it a little bit more dynamic here, and then we're going to take it a step further here at the last few minutes that we have as well. So first steps are that we need to do is we need to create some parameters. And then we're going to bring in the data set that we see here to be able to make those parameters dynamic. Okay? So let's do this. I'm going to flip over back to reporting services for a moment to create those parameters, and then we'll bring in the data set. So I'll right-click on my parameters, select to add a parameter. I'll call this parameter my measure name, and I'll make the prompt select your value. Because again, the prompt here is more for the user, so I want it to be really clear to them what they're doing here. Okay, select your value. It will be a text data type. And then under default, I'm going to give it a default value. And then we're going to come back to manipulating the available values here the last few minutes. So first things first, I'm going to give this a default value. My default value, I'm going to hard code in here, and I'm going to make it the internet sales amount. So you guys can just watch this part. So I'm going to hard code in a measure name. Now it does have to be in MDX speak here. So I'm actually feeding it a little bit of MDX language, and because that is the measure value that I want to show by default whenever a user runs the report. That's the default measure they're going to see. And then we're going to worry about at the end about how we can make that dynamic and have where they can select it from a drop-down box. I have two other parameters I want to create. The next parameter I want to create is one that I'll also do some hard coding in, but that's okay. You'll see why I want to do that. This one is where I'm going to allow them to decide how many months to look back. Because right now, I've hard coded it to look back 12 months. Well, I want them to have a little bit of flexibility where they can say, oh, you can default it to 12 months if you want, but I really want to have the flexibility where I can look back to the previous month or the last 6 months or 2 months or 3 months or whatever it may be. I want to give them the flexibility to be able to change that. So to do that, I'm going to parameterize that as well. I'll create a parameter here called, let's call it lag month is fine. And I'll say, so for the users, select months back. You know, you can name it whatever you want. Whatever makes sense to them. They'll probably come up with a prompt name for you. Okay. Now this one is going to also be text because it's going to pass into our string value. I know it seems like an integer, but it's going to pass into a string query that we provided. And then we're going to give it some available values that we're going to hardcode in. Because I don't want my users to just be able to type in whatever they, I don't want them to be able to type in like 100 months back because they might get results that they wouldn't expect. So I'm going to limit them a little bit to the number of months they can look back. I'll tell them they can look back 1, 2, 3, 6 months, or maybe 12 months back. So I'm limiting them a little bit, but it's more of a control to make sure that they don't get out of hand with how they're using the report. Okay, so just think of this parameter value that I'm hard coding here as the possible numbers they can look back. And whatever value they select out of this drop-down box that we're creating will be filled into this parallel period calculation here. It'll be replacing this guy. Okay. All right, so I'll hit OK. We got one more parameter I'm going to create. Okay, and that parameter is going to be the start date of our range that we look at. Okay, so I'm going to call this the start date parameter. I'll say select a start date. Okay, this one's going to be a date time. Okay, and then I'll also give this one a default value as well. So the default value for this one, I'm using the EventuWorks cube here just so you guys can replicate it when you go back to work. So I'm going to have to give it a date that's a little bit further back of January 1st, 2007. So you guys should be able to replicate this going back to your EventuWorks cube. Okay, so all I've done so far is I've created parameters. If I preview this, I'll see parameters, but they're not tied to anything at this point. They're not tied and they're not forced into the report data set. My next step is to force the report data set to actually use these parameters. And I've pre-written the query here for you to save on time, but I will walk through it with you. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this into my report. Okay, so in my report data set, what I'm going to do is instead of going to the query designer, I'm actually going to make this query into an expression. So instead of having a standard query, I'm going to make the query based off of a reporting services expression that we write. So I'll simply hit the expression button here, and I'm going to replace the data set that you have here with a dynamic one that actually passes in the new query or new parameter values that we just created a moment ago. Tell you what, I'm actually going to walk through this one with you so you guys can see every bit of it, and it doesn't, there's no time lapse here as far as me pasting in a completed query. So what I'm going to do to make this work, again, is to make this a expression. So if I'm going to make this into an expression, I need to have an equal sign at the beginning, right? And I also need to have double quotes because I really have this really big literal string that I'm trying to pass into it, right? This whole thing is going to be a string value. Now, the best way I've found to do this is really to make every line into a string and just concatenate it all together because it makes it a little easier to read. So what I usually do is I'll come through and I will create a string for every line of code here. And I just do that more for myself to be able to read it later. Okay, so all I'm doing again is just concatenating a bunch of lines of code together. And then we'll get into the parameter piece here in a moment. Okay. All right. So that's my standard query here I've written that I've just made into a string. That's all I've done to it so far. But now what I want to do is replace some of these values that I have here, like this internet sales amount, with a parameter that I've just created. So I'll go under my parameters, find my measure name, and replace my measure name parameter with the internet sales that was hard-coded in here previously. Now, remember I have this literal string, so I'm going to need to concatenate these things together and also pass in a few extra double quotes to be able to get it just right. Let's just try it like this so it's less confusing. Now, you'll notice I had the string to value in here previously. That string to value I wrote in here ahead of time so that it could take this string and turn it into a measure for us. Okay, so we've provided this measure name, and then the next thing that we're going to do is replace the number of months that we're going to look back with my lag month parameter. So I'll take my lag month parameter, double click on that guy, and then I'm going to move my double quotes onto the other side of that, just like so. Okay, so all I did there was I moved my double quotes on the other side because I really have this number that's the end of the line here. So just imagine this parameter as a number. I'm going to look back 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 12 months, 6 months, whatever the user selects. Okay. Then I'm going to go a little bit further down because I also want to make it so that my start date can be dynamic. This one's a little trickier. The start date, again, imagine or envision that you're trying to pass in MDX code, but I have a parameter inside reporting services called start date. That's a date time. So I'm trying to pass in a date time value into MDX code here. And because of that, I'm going to have to do a little bit of formatting of the date time value that I get to fit directly into the MDX that I need. All right? So the way this is going to work is first we're going to take the date that's inside my MDX, and I'm going to replace that with my start date parameter. Okay, so that's your first step. Replace that hard-coded date with your parameter. Then I need to make this into a string that concatenates that date together. So I'm going to go ahead and put my double quotes and plus sign here so it concatenates that all together. It's like I missed it a little bit there. There we go. And then, like I mentioned a moment ago, I'm also going to need to format this date value properly for MDX. If you remember when before I deleted that, the MDX looked something like this. It was the month, the year, the month, and the day, something like this. So 2008, January 1st. And because the MDX is formatted like that, I need to make sure that the value I provide from my date parameter is also formatted like that. So to convert it into a proper format, I'm going to use the format function here. That's a reporting services expression. And I'm going to format that value in the proper syntax for our date time parameter. So the proper syntax for us would be the year, month, day format. Okay? Zoom in on that for you. So again, this is the format that our MDX is in, so I need to make sure that I make the parameter value pass in the exact same way. And really, that's it. It seems almost too simple. You know, I had to go through and make quite a few changes as far as adding in double quotes all over the place. But again, you don't have to do that. That just makes it a little easier to read, so that's why I like to do it that way. Now, this isn't the only way that you can pass in parameters into reporting services. I choose to do it through expressions because it's a little easier to read. But you could also do this, if I hit OK, you could also do this in the query designer, and you could pass in parameters there as well. It's just not as user-friendly for me to do parameters through the query designer. And especially when you want to pass in values into MDX. If you're using the drag and drop interface, yeah, it's really easy to do parameters. But when you actually have wrote the MDX yourself, then the passing in of parameters is a little bit more difficult. And I'll show you what I mean here in a moment. Actually, I'll show you what I mean right now. So if I had a data set that I wanted to pass in parameters in, let's say I do one more data set here. Okay, so I would go to the query designer, and I go to my MDX tab here and replace my code in here. If I wanted to put a parameter in here, I'd have to use this little query parameter button. Unfortunately, it's really not very user-friendly. It's pretty difficult to get exactly what you want inside here. So my preference is to do it using the expressions that I'm showing right now. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. So the way I've chosen to do it this time is with a big expression that pre-populates my query. So now my query is really an expression, and that expression gets evaluated whenever the user passes in parameter values, and it runs the query at that time. It even generates the query at that time because they could change the query based on a parameter selection. Okay? May not be the best for performance, especially if you're doing things like caching inside the cube or even caching and reporting services. It could kind of be hindrance towards performance, but it does give a really nice effect as far as how the design of the report is. Okay, so let's see what we have so far. So far, I've created the parameters. I've tied those parameters to my data set. So now if I preview, I should see a report that will vary based off a parameter selection. So if I select pay close attention to the lines here, if I change this to 6 months instead of 12 months, you'll notice the lines are slightly different. So comparing this year to 6 months ago, or this date to 6 months ago, I'm going to have a different trend line. Okay, so you can see those tied differently out here. And the blue lines appear to be changing, but they're really not. It's just the scale that is changing and making it appear different. I can also change my dates, so I can say, all right, I don't want to look at January, I want to look at March. Let's look at March 31st, and you can see my dates have also changed. So I'm starting at March 31st, going the next 30 days, and I'm looking at the trending of those dates over the last 3 months here. I could also change my measure. So instead of looking at internet sales amount, I could look at internet, let's say, tax amount, assuming that's a measure. Hit View Report, and now I'm looking at a different measure. Okay, hard to tell, so we got a little bit more work to do. It's hard to tell that I'm looking at a different measure, but I am. I'm looking at the internet tax amount now instead of the internet sales amount. Now the next step to really take this report to the next level. This is pretty cool. This is cool. We've made it dynamic, but I want to make it so that my users have the ability to select the measure that they want. Instead of typing the measure that they want, I want them to be able to select it from a drop-down box. I want them to have the same functionality that they have for the months for the values or the measures. So I want to give them a list of all the measures. You pick which measure you want, and then it fills in the report based off the drop-down selection. Okay? All right, so let's talk about how we're going to do that. Now, think about how you would populate a drop-down box even in a regular report. Let's say a regular relational database report. You have to have some kind of data set that populates a drop-down box. Okay? In this case, on the right-hand side, we've hard-coded in a list of selections. But if we want to make this drop-down selection dynamic, we have to have some kind of query that hits the database and returns back the possible values. And in this case, we not only want to return back the possible values, we want to return back the metadata of our cube. The metadata of our cube, specifically the measures that exist inside of our cube. Okay? Now this is where the dynamic management views come into play. I mentioned dynamic management views at the very early or the very beginning of the session, and here's where it's going to come into play. Is we're going to actually write a dynamic management view, or I'm going to provide you one, that will return back a list of all of the measures that we have inside of our cube, and then we'll fill in this value or this parameter with a list of all of our possible measures. Okay? So let's go look at the query. I've already written it for you. Again, I'll provide you the code on my blog after the session, probably tomorrow morning. All right, so here's the last query that we're going to look at. I'll even provide you the file here that has everything you need in here. This last query is a dynamic management view for analysis services. And basically, this is the name of the DMV here. There's a lot of DMVs inside of analysis services. In fact, there's some pretty good blog posts out there that will walk you through looking at each of these. I could change that to look at my dimensions instead, and I could do something like select star and see all of the dimensions I have. So there's a lot of different DMVs that you can play around with. The one we're going to look at is specifically going to return back the measures that we have. So not only am I returning back the measures, which you can see here on the left-hand side, here's a list of all my measures, but I also need to return back the unique name for those measures, which is basically a keyword for the MDX. This is the MDX that I need to plug into the query so that I return back the proper string, or really syntax, I should say. So this is the proper syntax that I pass into my query, and then this is going to be the label. So you can already kind of envision how this is going to come together. I'm going to feed in this query This is going to populate the label of my drop-down box, and this is going to populate the value of my drop-down box. So when they select amount, it's really going to pass in measures.amount into my query. Okay. Now we could get a little more fancy with it if we wanted to. I don't really have, look like I don't have enough time to do this, but I could actually have the data types map over to reporting services as well. So these are the data types inside the cube. Unfortunately, these don't exactly map to reporting services data types. So you do have currency data types, but it's really, this would be, I would have to do some kind of switch function or if statement inside reporting services to map an analysis services data type to a data type inside reporting services. Be that as it may, it can be done, and that's why I've included it in the query here so you can play around with that on your own. Now for our purposes, we're going to take this query that I've provided you, this query against the dynamic management view, this dynamic management view right here. I'm going to take this query, take it into reporting services, go back to my design mode, okay, and I'm going to add a new data set. So I'll select Add Data Set, and I'm going to create a brand new data set here, but this one's going to be done a little bit differently than what we did previously. So here's what I mean by that. I'm going to go under Data Set, Data Source, make sure I select the correct data source, and then instead of going to the Query Designer, I'm just going to go to the expression right away. So I'm going to go to the expression button here for my query, take off the equal sign. So that's a little confusing. I'll tell you what I mean by that here in a moment. I'm actually going to take off the equal sign because it's not going to be an expression. It's just going to be a select statement. So one thing you'll notice about this DMV, and let me go back to Management Studio here for a moment. One thing you'll notice about this dynamic management view is it's really like T-SQL. It is T-SQL basically. But you'll notice I'm not running it against a relational database. I'm running it against a cube. It has a standard select statement, a from, a where, and an order by, just like you would write in T-SQL. So it's very different in that it's not really MDX. I'm running it against a MDX data source, a cube, but it's written like T-SQL. Okay, so I just want to point that out. And because of that, if I had chosen to try and go under the Query Designer and go to my MDX tab here and paste this in, this will not work because it's really more like T-SQL. So the way we have to run these inside of reporting services is not to do it here. I'm actually going to go back to the expression button like I started to, take off the equal sign because it's not an expression, and paste in my query. So it's just like I'm running some T-SQL against the cube. I'll hit OK. You'll see my query comes through here properly. And if I go to fields, you'll see it does bring across the fields properly as well. So I have measure name, I have measure unique name, and my format string as well. Okay. All right, so we'll hit OK. Now from here, after this point, this is just like any other relational report that has a drop-down box parameter. So if I know how to do parameters with drop-down selections, then I'm golden now. I know exactly what to do. I'm going to go to my parameter, tell it that the available values, this is where I could make the drop-down box selection, but I'll go to my available values, tell it that I'm going to get the values for the drop-down box from a query. That query is going to be dataset 2. I should name those a little better. Dataset 2 is the one you see here on the left that has the measure name, measure unique name. The value, I wish I could ask you guys questions, because what I would ask you is, what would I select here? The value is going to be the unique name, which again is the MDX. The measure name is just the literal name of the measure, so this is going to be my label. Okay, so for my value, I'm going to select measure unique name. For my label, I'll select measure name. And again, the whole purpose of that is so that my users see the list of each of my measures, but when they select that, it's still going to pass through MDX to my main query. All right, so I'll hit OK here. Let's see what we have so far. I still have a little bit more work to do, but let's go ahead and preview what we have so far and see what happens. So I'm going to preview this. Tell you what, let me go default my month parameter as well. I'm going to default this to 12. Okay, so when I preview this, I should see results right away. There we go. All right, so I'm seeing here now I have a drop-down selection for all of my parameter. I'm sorry, all of my measures. I can select any measure I want, view the report. You'll notice there's a slight difference there. Let's pick a different one. Let's pick unit price. So less significant here. I'm trying to pick one that's going to have a significant change here. Okay, there's a significant change. So this one I have order quantity, not a whole lot of data within this date range. So I would probably want to do something like go back a couple of months or go back a couple of years and see if I have any kind of significant change here. That might be a bad measure to select here. But I could easily flip back to different measures, that's a good one, and see the tax amount properly listed here for my year. So it's just made it where it's a lot more dynamic and a lot more flexible for my users to pick what they want. Okay? All right, good deal. So you know what it seems like? I want to make sure that this is working properly. I think I may be missing some extra double quotes around here. I want to make sure that's working exactly right. So let me add that. I'm afraid it's using the hard-coded default value. So let's see if I try this one more time, if I get a little bit bigger variance there. There we go. That's more significant. Okay. So what I did there, just to briefly tell you what I did, I just added some more double quotes around it. I think it was reading in my default value and not passing in my parameter properly. So I went into my data set, added a couple extra double quotes in there. Okay. So that's really neat. We've done some good work here. I like what we've done so far. But if someone grabbed this report and they looked at it, really we just have some cleanup to do now. Things like the labels, the access title, the title of the report. There's some things in here we can do to really clean it up to make it pop and look a little better. So what we can do is actually go into things like our labels, our series labels, and fix these so that they come through a little easier to read. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to make it so that the selected measure actually shows the parameter value that they select. The title, I'll fix things like that. The label of the axis here, I'll fix. And then right now, we're just doing some cleanup. So I'm going to go into design. I'm going to go to my, there we go. I'm going to go to my series property for the selected measure. And I'll go under legend. And this is where I can give it a custom label for the legend. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to go and make it so that the users, whenever they select a measure, it's going to pass it into the actual report, and they'll see the measure name pop through to the report label. Now this isn't exactly what I want. I really want the label, because let me show you what happens if I do this. If I run the report now, notice what it shows up in my legend. It shows the MDX. And that's not very useful to the users. The users want to see internet sales there, right? Internet sales amount. So that's an easy fix. I can go back to design, find the legend label again under my series properties, and instead of just bringing in the measure name value, I'll change this to the measure name label, and then that way it'll properly show my measure name, internet sales amount. And as much as I change, if I change the internet tax amount, or if I change to one of the averages we looked at, or order quantity, it will pass in internet order quantity into my label as well. So that's just a little cleanup, but nice things you can do to make it pop. I also would like, let me go back to design here. I'd also like to make it so my trend value is a little more clear on what it is as well. Probably want to have some kind of an expression in there so that I can easily tell exactly what my users have selected as a, what am I trying to say, as a lag. Remember we had that lag parameter, they can select how many months they want to look back. Here's where I can tell it exactly the number of months that's going to be labeled here. So I would go to my trend value here, go to my series properties, go to my legend again, and then let's change this to show my parameter value, which was lag months, and then I'll concatenate the lag months with, let's say just some text here that identifies as this many months ago. Okay, so it's going to show the number of months that they selected, and then I'm going to put some text in here as well. I could also bring in the parameter name, so if I wanted to, I could even concatenate my measure name in here, so it's really clear that I'm looking at internet sales 12 months ago. Okay, let me give a little bit of space in here. So a basic little expression, but what it's going to do for me is really label this report so it's clear to the users what they're looking at. Okay, let's preview this. Oh, look, I made the mistake again. So right now, it's exactly what I'm looking for. I just need to point this to the labels instead of the value. So it would say internet sales 12 months ago. And then if I change this from 12 to 6, it should say internet sales 6 months ago. Okay? And I may want to put some logic in there so that if they select 1, that it says month ago instead of months ago. But that's all stuff you could easily do with some reporting services expressions. Let me fix very quickly this to show the label. And then that way my parameter value, or really my label value, will come through properly. Okay. Now there's other things I can do that, again, it's all cleanup at this point. So I could make my chart title dynamic as well, so it's based off of the parameter values that were selected. So I could do something like, let's go back to the value over here. I could do something like an expression on that title, and actually make it so that I have an expression for what the title comes through as. So you have a lot of flexibility here to make this dynamic. And you guys know how to do expressions. I would expect if you're in a session like this, you're fairly familiar with expressions. Okay. Now I did want to try and save some time for questions because this is DMVs and analysis services are a pretty new topic for some people. So what we may do for the last 5 or 10 minutes here is take some questions, because that's really it for the demo. Now what I would recommend for you guys to do, let me go back to my main machine over here, is check out some of the previous webinars on pragmaticworks.com, and I'd also suggest that you look at our virtual training. So if you were really interested in this topic, we actually do a Master's Reporting Services class, which we don't have any online right now. Maybe Rachel can look at that, but we don't have any. We offer a Master's Reporting Services class, and one of the topics in that is reporting off of the cube. And I just showed you one small section of that reporting off of the cube here. There's much more that we go into, showing some more advanced MDX functionality, as well as I showed this demo in that as well. So this kind of gives you a subset of that. Also, like Rachel mentioned at the beginning of our webinar, actually before we started the webinar, if you're attending past Summit, I'm actually offering, or not offering, I will be teaching with Brian Knight, a pre-conference seminar where we show all of 2012 BI, so building a solution off of 2012 BI, and we've got some topical data that'll make it really interesting. So Rachel, if you want to jump in for the last 10 minutes or so here, I think I can take some questions.
Okay, yeah, sure. Again, we are currently, we're in the process of posting our new virtual training classes for 2013, so do check back, and all the new classes should be up shortly. Here are some questions. I'm not sure where you stopped. I know you answered some as you went, Devin, so I'll just start from the bottom.
Sure.
I take it you can also do dynamic dimensions. Just use one data type per chart?
You can, yeah, so that's a great question. There are some limits. So Dan, to kind of answer your question and maybe answer some others' questions, is you could do dynamic dimensions. There's a really good book out. It's the Reporting Services Recipe book, and they actually have some examples that are like this, and they also have a report demonstration of how to build a completely dynamic. So you saw I hard-coded some things in here. I hard-coded in dimension data and things like that. They actually have in that book an example of everything being dynamic, where you can make the dimension dynamic and it kind of builds out a report for you. Now, I would say the one thing you can't make dynamic, or at least I haven't been able to make dynamic, is the cube name. So you may notice that inside my query, I had the cube hard-coded in here to AdventureWorks. That, unfortunately, you're stuck in it being dynamic. So I'm sorry, you're stuck in that being hard-coded. That one, there is some DMVs that will return back data for cube names, but that one has to be static. I'm looking at the questions here too, so I see. Okay. Can you quickly demonstrate how to make the MDX dynamic using parameters in Query Designer? Oh, okay. It's a little bit more of a lengthy demonstration. Sorry, Rachel, if you don't mind, I'll...
No problem. While you're getting everything ready, I was just going to answer David really quick. The Master's Reporting class runs for $7.95 normally, unless it's on promotion. And if you want more information about that, just feel free to email me. I believe you have my email address in the confirmation. But again, it's rmatuson@pragmaticworks.com.
Good deal. So there was a question about how to make the parameters dynamic using MDX in the query designer. Now, if you're just using the drag and drop interface, you can always drag up parameters up top here as a filter and then check off this little parameter box. But what I was actually talking about, that's easy. That's simple to do, right? That's all drag and drop. What I was talking about earlier was how you can make the MDX dynamic. And if you had written your own MDX, let's say I wrote my own MDX right here, and I wanted to parameterize any piece of it, I would have to replace these values with something like an @lag month. So that would be my parameter value, and then I hit the parameter button here and tell it which parameter I wanted to pass through and which value that's mapped to. So it's a little bit more difficult, or it's not as straightforward, I guess I would say, but it can be done in this window as well. It's just using the app symbol here. Okay. Let's see, next question. What are the alternate ways of generating data sets? So hopefully he's asking specifically off of a cube. So if you wanted to generate data sets directly off of a cube, typically what you'll do, let me create a new data set here. Most people would probably opt for using the query designer. The query designer is probably the #1 way that you'll create reports off of a cube because it's all drag and drop, right? It's the easiest way to do it. It's the fastest way to generate a data set for your report. The other ways are you can write the MDX yourself, and I kind of showed that today, where you can write the MDX yourself and then put it in the design mode here. I've had a lot of people tell me they learn MDX by using this drag and drop interface here. So a lot of people are familiar with creating drag and drop reports. So they'll actually do some dragging and dropping here, and that was a bad combination I did. But they'll go to the design mode and they'll see the MDX that generated, and that's how a lot of people actually learn how to do MDX. Next question. So the answer to that one, Andrew, was you can use the drag and drop query designer, or you can write the MDX yourself. What SQL Server version did SSRS metadata become available in? I believe that was 2008. So I don't think it existed in 2005. DMVs were available in SQL Server, the database engine, in 2005, but they didn't become available in analysis services until 2008. So if you're using 2008, you'll be able to use the DMVs. And I actually have, I mentioned my blog earlier, I actually have blogged on this topic before. So if you go to my blog, devonknightsql.com, it's also on BIDN as well, I show an example of how to do this there as well, using DMVs to build right here, using analysis services dynamic management views to build dynamic reports. So I actually reference a couple other people that have written some good posts on the analysis services DMVs, and I'd recommend you take a look at that. So that's on my blog. Will this presentation be available recording to see later too? Rachel, you want to answer that?
Sure. All of our sessions are recorded, and they are available on our website. If you go to pragmaticworks.com and go to free training under our Learning Center, and then there's a large button that says past webinars, and they're all posted there. They're archived, so they're also searchable.
Good. What's the turnaround on that? Is it a couple days? I'm sorry.
Yeah, a couple days. It'll definitely be posted by the end of the week.
Okay.
So.
Got a few more moments for questions. Rachel, do you have anything else before? Should I save you some time, or?
No, go for it.
Okay. All right. Next question I see here is: do you have to have a fixed number of SSRS data fields? What if you want to bring more than one field coming back? Yeah, you're not limited to a fixed number, so you can have really as many fields as you want. If I'm reading that correctly, yeah, whatever your MDX returns back, or whatever your SQL query against the DMVs returns back can be as many fields as you want. There was another question here. Alexander asked, why didn't I use the traditional method? I actually just showed this a moment ago. So he was asking, why didn't I use the traditional method of doing the parameters, where I just showed this a moment ago, where you do the @ sign and the parameter name. It really gets kind of messy in there, in my opinion, so I kind of like doing it using the expressions. It's a lot cleaner to look at. In my opinion, I just kind of like that way. It's a little better. So I wanted to make sure I showed you could do it both ways, but I find it a little easier in the expression than I do here. What function were you using in MDX to compare a previous period? Will that function work for current year to date versus previous year to date? So this is Adams is asking. I was using parallel period to compare the current view of the data, so whatever I selected to however number of months I wanted to look back. If you want to get a to-date, a year-to-date, or a month-to-date, that one would not accomplish that. You would either, if you wanted to do like a year-to-date, there is a YTD function in MDX, or there's a periods-to-date function. You could use either of those in MDX if you wanted to get a year-to-date value. So the example I showed was using parallel period. Let me bring that back up here. Yep, right here. So parallel period just gives that, at that moment in time, what were my sales comparatively. Okay, so no to date in this. But you could do that. I could absolutely have like a periods to date in here as well. Let's see what else we have. Are you working with Visual Studio 2008? I was. That could be done in 2012 as well. So the traditional reporting services in 2012 has not changed at all. So you'll be able to do the same things I just showed in Reporting Services 2012. Many of you are already aware of. There's a lot of new stuff, though, in Reporting Services 2012 with things like Power View. So there's a lot of other things in Reporting Services now outside of this traditional method of showing reports like we did today. So that was another question we had. Another question we have, is there any way to join two data sets? Let's say both data sets have a common key. This is Jahan. Yes, absolutely you can. So the way you would do that is with a lookup function. So let's say, for example, you have, let me whiteboard this. This is a really good question that I get often. I've blogged about this one as well. So his question is, I have data set 1 over here. And let's say this data set is from Oracle. Ooh, yucky, but it is. This one's from Oracle. This one's from SQL. If I could type. And this is data set 2. Now, I could do some nasty stuff with linked servers or something like that to be able to get this in here. But I could also join those two data sets inside reporting services. So his question is, I have some common field between the two that I would use to join. So I don't care what the other data is in here, but I have some kind of common field that I could use to join the two together. You absolutely can do that. I actually do show this in the Reporting Services Masterclass we talked about. And you would do that using the lookup function inside Reporting Services. So look into the lookup function. That'll answer your question. Okay, and I think we're out of time here. I burned through questions pretty fast there.
I'm done.
Rachel, you want to wrap us up? By the way, guys, let me put my I say wrap us up and then I go talk more, huh?
Yeah, I know. I like that trick. That was good.
So I didn't mean to open Outlook. I actually meant to put my slide back up. So if you have questions, you feel free to email me. You can follow me on Twitter there. I have all my information.